Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at the book of Isaiah,
Ooh, Isaiah.
chapters 4 through 6.
Excellent.
I always like Isaiah because, it just has such vivid imagery and a lot of intense emotions,
Oh, yeah,
a
absolutely.
lot of hope, a lot of judgment, and
Yeah, a lot of judgment.
a lot of resilience in there, too.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how all of that kind of comes together in these chapters. It's like you said, the whole spectrum of human emotion right there.
Right. And it's all packed in these 3 chapters.
Yeah.
So I guess, just to set the scene a little bit, we're looking at, excerpts from chapters 4, 5, and 6 of the book of Isaiah.
Right.
And we're going to kind of trace this theme of, judgment and hope and resilience throughout.
Yeah, and what's so striking, I think, when you read through these chapters is how it goes from this really hopeful image in chapter 4 to, these warnings and woes in chapter 5.
Yeah.
And then it culminates in Isaiah's, powerful vision in chapter 6.
Right. Yeah. And, just starting out with chapter 4, it opens with this really powerful image of women clinging to men,
Yeah.
desperate to kind of escape disgrace. Like, what is that? What could that possibly be symbolizing about, the state of society at the time?
Well, I think it speaks to this deep sense of fear and uncertainty. You have to remember the historical context here. There was a very real threat of war and exile hanging over the people.
Oh, wow.
So you can imagine this sense of desperation.
Like grasping for something.
Exactly. They're clinging to anything that might offer some semblance of security.
Right.
Yeah.
Like just that basic need for safety and stability.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes you think about how we react in times of crisis.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it's not just about physical safety either. It's also about social standing.
Oh,
They're worried about losing their honor, their place in society.
so there's a sense of shame, too, almost.
Oh, definitely. There's this fear of being cast out, rejected.
Yeah, like being left behind when everything falls apart.
Right. It's a very powerful image.
And then right in the middle of all this potential disaster, we get this glimmer of hope with the introduction of the branch of the Lord.
Oh, yeah. The branch.
Such a loaded term.
It is. It's not just any branch. It's this recurring symbol in the Old Testament.
Oh, I didn't realize it went that far back.
Oh, yeah. It goes way back. It's
Yeah.
like this foreshadowing of a future messianic king.
Okay, so a righteous leader who's going to come and set things right.
Exactly. Someone who will bring peace and justice, restore order.
Wow. So in the midst of all this chaos, there's still this promise of a brighter future.
Absolutely. There's always that thread of hope running through Isaiah, even in the darkest moments.
I like that. That's encouraging.
Yeah, it's like a light at the end of the tunnel.
And then the way God's protective presence is described in this chapter is just incredible.
Oh, yeah. The imagery is so powerful.
The cloud by day smoke and fire by night, a shelter from the heat and the storms.
It's like this all-encompassing protection, like being wrapped in a warm blanket.
Right. It creates this sense of being enveloped by something bigger than yourself.
Yeah, like a refuge from the craziness of the world.
It makes you crave that feeling of safety and security.
Oh, totally. We all long for that, don't we? That feeling of being protected and cared for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I guess this sense of hope and security sets us up for a pretty stark contrast.
Oh, yeah.
Because chapter 5 takes a definite turn.
It does buckle up because we're about to dive into some serious judgment.
Yeah, it's like the tone shifts completely with the parable of the vineyard,
The vineyard.
which feels almost like a cautionary tale.
It totally is. It's this allegory for Israel.
Okay, so the vineyard represents the nation.
Right. And God is the one who planted it. He tended to it. He did everything right.
But the fruit it produced wasn't what he expected.
Not even close. He's basically saying, look, I put all this effort in, and this is what I get.
Ouch. You can almost feel his disappointment.
Right. It's like when a parent pours their heart into raising a child.
And then the child just goes off and makes all the wrong choices.
Exactly. It's heartbreaking.
And the consequences in the parable are pretty clear.
Oh, yeah. There's destruction, neglect, ultimately exile.
It's a pretty powerful image of what happens when we turn away from what's good for us.
Yeah, like straying from the path and ending up lost and alone.
And then we're hit with this series of woes.
The woes. Yeah, those are something else.
It's definitely a shift from the hopeful imagery of chapter 4.
For sure. These woes are pronouncements of judgment against specific social injustices and spiritual failings.
And they don't hold back.
Not at all. It's like Isaiah is just laying it all out there.
Greed, drunkenness, disregard for the poor. It's a pretty scathing indictment of the state of society.
It is. And it's not just ancient history either.
Right. some of these woes feel incredibly relevant to our world today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The pursuit of wealth and pleasure at the expense of others, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the indifference to suffering.
It's like we're still making the same mistakes.
It makes you wonder, have we learned anything?
That's a good question to ponder. But before we get too bogged down in the doom and gloom, chapter 6 takes us to a whole other level.
Oh, yeah. Isaiah's vision in this chapter is mind-blowing.
It's like we're suddenly transported to this grand throne room,
Filled with smoke, and Isaiah finds himself face to face with God.
surrounded by these magnificent creatures called seraphim.
Seraphim, 6 wings covering their faces and feet. It's intense.
Intense is an understatement. What's the significance of all that? Like, what are the seraphim all about?
Well, they're often described as these angelic beings,
Okay.
and the 6 wings represent reverence, humility, obedience to God.
So it's not just some random image. It's all very symbolic.
Exactly. Every detail in this vision has a deeper meaning.
And the seraphim's constant cry of holy, holy, holy
Mm.
emphasizes the sheer power and purity of God's presence.
Yeah, no wonder Isaiah's immediate reaction is, "Woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips."
Right. I mean, who wouldn't be terrified in that situation? But what does he mean by unclean lips? Is that just about bad language?
It's more than that. In that culture, unclean lips also referred to being unworthy to speak God's word.
Oh, so it's like feeling inadequate to speak out about what you believe in.
Exactly. That feeling of, who am I to say anything?
Yeah, that feeling can be paralyzing.
It can.
Yeah.
But then we see this amazing act of purification.
Oh, right, with the burning coal.
Yes, a seraph takes a burning coal from the altar and touches Isaiah's lips.
It's like this symbolic cleansing.
It is. It makes him worthy to speak for God.
Wow. So it's about overcoming that feeling of inadequacy and stepping into your purpose.
I think so. It's a powerful image of grace and empowerment.
And that leads us to Isaiah's commission, which is, well, let's just say it's a bit paradoxical.
Little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's told to preach a message that might actually harden people's hearts.
Wait, what? That doesn't make sense. Why would God want to harden people's hearts?
It's not about God actively causing people to turn away.
Yeah.
It's about revealing the state of their hearts, which are already hardened.
So it's more about exposing the truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable.
Precisely.
And that leads to Isaiah's question, how long, Lord?
Yeah. He wants to know how long this cycle of rebellion and judgment will continue.
And God's answer is pretty sobering.
It is. He describes a coming devastation, cities left desolate, people scattered.
It's a heavy image. But even in this bleak prediction, there's that glimmer of hope with the holy seed.
Right. The remnant that will remain faithful.
So even in judgment, there's a promise of preservation, a spark of resilience that can't be extinguished.
Exactly.
Mm.
And that's a good place to stop for now, I think. We've covered a lot of ground,
Yeah, we have.
but there's still so much more to explore.
We'll have to pick up on that holy seed and what it means for us today in the next part of our deep dive.
Definitely. That's where it gets really interesting.
So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back.
So that holy seed we were talking about,
Yeah.
it's this tiny little glimmer of hope amidst all that devastation.
Like a little spark, right? In the darkness.
Exactly. It represents those who remain faithful even when everything's falling apart.
So even with all the talk of judgment and exile, God's plan isn't totally abandoned.
Right? It's like imagine a wildfire ripping through a forest. It looks like total destruction, right? But deep down, some of those roots survive
Oh, I see.
and they can sprout new life.
It's a powerful image. Like even when things seem hopeless, there's always potential for renewal.
Exactly. And this theme of a faithful remnant, it pops up all over the Old Testament.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It points toward this ultimate hope of restoration and redemption.
Okay, so we've got this whole roller coaster of hope, judgment, and then a hint of future restoration. But what does it all mean for us today? How do we connect these ancient words to our modern lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because these chapters come from a specific historical context.
Right.
But the themes are universal.
Yeah, they're about the human condition.
Exactly. Our tendency to mess up the consequences that follow and that deep need for hope.
So even though we're not facing literal exile,
Right.
those chapters still speak to us.
Absolutely. Think about those woes. Isaiah describes greed and justice, chasing empty pleasures.
Yeah.
Those things haven't disappeared, have they?
Sadly, no. It's like looking in a mirror sometime.
It is. And the consequences are still very real. Broken relationships, societal breakdown, that feeling of emptiness.
So are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? Is that the takeaway?
Not necessarily. Remember, Isaiah isn't all doom and gloom. It's also about hope and restoration.
Right, that holy seed image, like a light in the darkness.
Exactly. Just as God preserved a remnant of his people back then, he offers that same hope to us today.
But how do we tap into that hope? What does it look like to be part of that holy seed in the 21st century?
That's a question we each have to grapple with. But I think it starts with acknowledging our need for guidance.
So admitting we don't have it all figured out.
Exactly, and being open to something bigger than ourselves.
So it's not just about avoiding the bad stuff, but actively seeking a deeper connection,
I think so. It's about aligning our actions with what's good and true.
even when it's tough.
Especially when it's tough.
There's a real sense of empowerment in that, though, isn't there? Knowing that even when we mess up, there's a way back.
Absolutely. That hope for renewal is incredibly powerful.
And that hope is tied to the promise of a coming Messiah.
The branch of the Lord.
Right. It's a reminder that God's plan is bigger than our immediate circumstances.
It's about something much bigger, something ultimately leading towards a future where things are set right.
It's a beautiful vision, but sometimes it feels overwhelming to live up to that ideal.
I hear you. It's a journey, not a destination.
And it's a journey we don't have to take alone.
Exactly.
So where do we go from here? How do we take these themes from Isaiah and apply them to our everyday lives?
Now, that's a great question, and it's one we'll dig into further in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know about you, but my head's still spinning a little bit.
It's a lot to process, right? All that talk of judgment and hope and...
Yeah, and those vivid images, like the seraphim and the burning coal
And the vineyard. Don't forget the vineyard.
right. But the goal isn't to just feel overwhelmed, right?
No, definitely not. It's to find those takeaways, those little nuggets of wisdom that we can actually use.
So less doom and gloom and more, okay, what do I do with this?
Exactly. Like if we think about Isaiah's commission,
To preach, even though people might not listen?
yeah, it's like he was told, go for it, even if it seems pointless.
And that can be so discouraging.
It can. When we try to do good or speak up for what we believe in and it feels like no one cares.
Oh, I know that feeling.
But Isaiah's example reminds us that our job isn't necessarily to change hearts.
Oh, so it's not about immediate results.
Right. It's about being faithful to the message, even when it's tough.
So it's more about planting seeds than seeing the harvest,
I love that because we might not see the immediate impact, but that doesn't mean those seeds aren't growing.
like those ripples in a pond.
Exactly. They spread out farther than we can see.
And speaking of ripples, remember that image of the holy seed.
Oh, yeah, that little spark of hope amidst all the chaos.
It reminds us that even when things seem dark and broken, there's still potential for growth.
It's about resilience.
So even in those tough times, we can be that seed, that spark of light.
Exactly. It's about nurturing that resilience in ourselves and in others.
And I think that connects back to what we were talking about earlier, that need for a deeper connection.
Something bigger than ourselves.
Right, because it's in that connection that we find the strength to keep going.
You got it. That connection is what sustains us. It's our refuge. It's what allows us to be a force for good.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of Isaiah.
Me too. It's amazing how these ancient words can still speak to us today.
It is. And I think what's really resonating with me is that sense of hope and resilience.
That's the key takeaway, isn't it? Even when things are tough, even when we feel lost, there's always a way back.
There's always that potential for renewal.
And that's something worth holding on to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into Isaiah chapters 4 through 6.
It was a wild ride.
It was. A huge thank you to you for guiding us through all of that.
My pleasure. It's always fun to dig into these texts.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has left you feeling inspired and maybe a little bit challenged.
Challenged in a good way, of course.
Of course, to go out there and be that holy seed in the world.
Be that spark of hope.
Exactly. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that spark alive.
And keep diving deep.
See you next time.